I do wonder if there are any other cards left to play, just based on the sanctions track record so far. But Trump's talking a lot about it there. At this point, when you start talking about it, it becomes something of a self-fulfilling prophecy at some point, because you can't just talk about it forever and then not do it, because at that point, you would just simply look quite weak as well.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had Josh Hammer on the show. He's the author of Israel and Civilization. He's the host of the Josh Hammer Show. He's also the editor-at-large of Newsweek. He's come on the show to speak about Putin and Trump, Trump's very harsh words about Putin and Putin's response. So all that, plus we speak to him about what's going on between Trump and Netanyahu, the problems between these two long-standing allies after the Middle East trip, and what's happened with this Iran nuclear deal. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday, on Times Radio's YouTube. Josh Hammer, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's jump into what we've seen over the weekend from Donald Trump. He's come out with these swinging words to Vladimir Putin. Of course, we saw Russia orchestrate a very large aerial attack on Ukraine over the weekend. And we saw Donald Trump write on Truth Social. I'm going to read it out for our viewers and our listeners. He said, "I've always had a very good relationship with Vladimir Putin of Russia, but something has happened to him. He has gone absolutely crazy. He's needlessly killing a lot of people. I'm not talking about soldiers, missiles and drones are being shot into cities in Ukraine for no reason whatsoever." So what's your reaction to this commentary from Donald Trump? Do you think he's coming to the realization that Putin just cannot be reasoned with?
Well, if you look back at Donald Trump's first term in office as president, he had this kind of twofold policy where, on the one hand, he was rhetorically quite aggressive against Vladimir Putin, but or at times he was actually rhetorically kind of friendly, but his public policy, on the other hand, was actually quite deterrent. You know, he put in fresh missile defense, for instance, in Poland and Czechia, various American, Central and Eastern European allies there. So he's taken policies in the past that tend to be tougher on Russia than I think the media here in the United States tend to give him credit for. Again, he has been kind of rhetorically chummy with Vladimir Putin. That is in line with kind of his much ballyhooed sit down with Kim Jong-un back in the first term there. I mean, Donald Trump certainly has no qualms about reaching out to some people who I think a lot of people would prefer that he not reach out to. As far as kind of contemporary policy, let's recall that in the 2024 presidential election cycle, Trump campaigned on getting a Russia-Ukraine peace within 24 hours. That obviously has not happened. I mean, as Selena Zito, the American columnist, said during the 2016 campaign, sometimes it's best to take Trump seriously, but not literally. And I think this 24-hour comment in the campaign trail context is probably another shining example of that. I think at this point, Donald Trump is really just pretty desperate for this war to come to an end. It's been a long time now, frankly. It's been over 3 years of carnage and bloodshed. The country of Ukraine, which is closer to an American ally certainly than Russia is, although neither country is necessarily kind of a true absolute stalwart. Ukraine has many of its own problems as well, but Russia is the aggressor in this war. But Trump really wants this war to wind down, and at this point, I think he's pretty desperate to do so. And if he thinks that sanctions are the way to accomplish that, I think that's probably what he will do.
Yeah, and we'll get into the sanctions, Josh, but yeah, you're right. I mean, he did come out with this 24-hour goal, and obviously that couldn't happen. He then came out saying he was sarcastic in true Trump comedy, but of course, the reality is, at least as soon as he was inaugurated, at least he was out there trying, which you can't say for every leader around the world, but. In response to Donald Trump's comments about Vladimir Putin, his spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, wrote a statement saying that this is a very crucial moment, which is associated, of course, with the emotional overload of everyone and with emotional reactions. Do you think that was quite a condescending remark to be making about the US president?
Yeah, that does seem to me to be quite condescending, but I mean, this is what the Kremlin does. I mean, if you look at public statements coming out of the Kremlin for many years now, they tend to take a very dim view, shall we say, of the United States and our leadership there. Again, I think Donald Trump is someone who does not come in necessarily with an ideologically pro-Ukraine, anti-Russian stance. Let's not forget that Vladimir Zelensky essentially campaigned with Kamala Harris there. I mean, he had that campaign stop with Kamala Harris at a munitions factory in Pennsylvania, a very important swing state there. Trump had his own dust-up with Zelensky at the White House back in late February there. So I don't think there's any love lost necessarily between Donald Trump and the government of Ukraine. But Donald Trump is a flexible realist. He is someone who, again, is looking for an off-ramp here. He's not necessarily looking for victory and defeat from an ideological lens. He's just a deal maker in this particular context there, and I think that he is willing to wheel and deal a little bit there. But he's also someone who, when you offend him, he's not willing to offend or to push back. I mean, that's kind of, I think, part of his pushback against Zelensky. When Zelensky campaigned with Kamala, now the criticism is coming not from Zelensky, but from Putin and the Kremlin there, and I do expect Donald Trump to similarly push back in kind.
You mentioned sanctions before, Josh, and this has been a roundabout conversation over how the United States will deal with Putin, because he's obviously, we're getting to a stage where we think that he's been drawing this war out. He's been putting a number of facades in place to try and make Donald Trump believe that he wants peace, and it's clear that Donald Trump is kind of at his wit's end now. He's not believing him anymore, and hence through that comment that he wrote on Sunday night on Truth Social. But is it time for Donald Trump to stop kind of these threats of sanctions and actually implement them immediately, whatever they may be? But of course, one of them that might hit Russia the most, which would be most detrimental to the economy, is if he places these tariffs on any country importing Russian oil.
Right. So let's recall that America already does have a lot of sanctions, actually, on Russia. We have a lot of sanctions when it comes to Russian arms manufacturers, weapons manufacturers, people like that. And, the Biden administration had a lot of those sanctions in place. Trump administration has kept essentially all of them in place, and at times has actually strengthened them there. So we are talking here about really just kind of specific types of new sanctions. The oil sanctions that you mentioned definitely are I think, one potential idea that could hit Russia hard. It really was the oil and natural gas export sanctions on Iran, a different adversary of the United States, that really hit that regime quite hard during the first Trump term, especially when it comes to China, Iran's number one importer of oil there. So I mean, you have to be careful on the one hand when it comes to sanctions, because some of the early onset sanctions from the Biden administration during the first year and a half of the war, going back to 2022, 2023, yes, they obviously, sanctions tend to cripple or hamstring Russia and the economy and the currency and so forth. They also have an effect on Americans, though. Sanctions are a bit of a two-way street, and they're a very crass instrument there. They definitely tend to sometimes hit American consumers. Oil and natural gas is obviously a global commodity. I mean, this is a commodity that is traded in global commodities markets, and these supply and demand for oil, in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, Venezuela, and so forth, no less affects the price of Americans here at the pump, than oil that is drilled in the fracking shales of Oklahoma or Wyoming or so forth there. So on the one hand, you have to be a little careful. It ends up being a little bit of a trade-off. I mean, Donald Trump has certainly shown through some of his other tariff policies that he is willing to potentially risk spiking prices for some goods in the short term to affect some other ideal or policy goal in the mid to long term here. So, if he decides that a potential risk in prices for oil and natural gas is worth it to try to get Vladimir Putin finally to the negotiating table, then that might be a prudential use of sanctions. It's one that I would probably be sympathetic to at this point there, because again, this war really does have to end. I do wonder if there are any other cards left to play, just based on the sanctions track record so far, but Trump's talking a lot about it there. And at this point, when you start talking about it, it becomes something of a self-fulfilling prophecy at some point, because you can't just talk about it forever and then not do it, because at that point, you would just simply look quite weak as well.
Absolutely, and I think that's kind of where people are getting at, Josh. I think there's this need to actually implement it. But as you mentioned, yes, we saw these tariffs, saw these sanctions on oil, on anything really affecting the American consumer at the start of this war. And that, coupled with the end of COVID-19, was obviously incredibly detrimental on oil and gas consumers in the United States. So it is a fair point. But how do you think Americans are feeling about this war? Do you think they're wanting Donald Trump to go a little bit harder on Putin?
I think Americans are mixed. Look, Americans, I think at this point in general, are a fairly war-weary people. I mean, America is not currently in active, hot conflict against the Russian Federation. There are no American boots on the ground there in eastern Ukraine, in the Crimean Peninsula there. So I don't want to overstate my point, but this definitely is a people that is generally war-weary. On the other hand, Donald Trump's America First Republican Party coalition is a coalition that generally stands for standing with our allies and punishing our enemies there. The interesting and difficult part about this conflict since day one, Russia is obviously the aggressor in this war. Putin is a very bad actor there. Zelensky and Ukraine have many of their own problems as well, as I've been saying since day one there. So this war, while Russia is clearly the closer thing to a bad guy, it doesn't necessarily fit an incredibly stark World War II-esque moral dichotomy between all out good and all out evil. There are various shades of gray there, and that's kind of where Donald Trump, I think, has been for years now. He's actually kind of towed this kind of realist kind of gray area middle ground a little bit. I think at this point he's just genuinely fed up with Vladimir Putin because he sees someone who is just simply not willing to sit down there. Again, he's not coming at this from an ideological standpoint. He's just coming at it from a let's just end this freaking war standpoint. That is basically his mentality. That's probably where most of the American people are at this point as well. Look, there are any number of hotspots around the world. America's number one threat this century, bar none, is China and its hegemonic communist party that's in charge there. So to the extent that the Russia-Ukraine theater really needs to start to fade in its importance as something of a potential distraction from the real threat there, I think that most Americans, and especially most Trump supporters, would probably support those measures.
And even, I've had John Bolton on the show a number of times. You wouldn't classify him as a staunch Trump supporter in any means, Josh. And he says that every time. He says China is the main threat here, and we can't lose sight of that. But you mentioned this thing about Trump losing patience and just being really over the situation. Do you think that Putin's banking on the fact that Trump will lose patience and eventually remove the United States from any sort of negotiating role?
That probably is exactly what Putin is waiting for, honestly. I mean, Donald Trump is something of a mercurial figure. I mean, let's just kind of call it like it is there. I mean, he is someone who does tend to kind of vacillate at times. He prevaricates when it comes to his policy initiatives. I mean, look at the whole tariff rollout there. We had so-called Liberation Day at the Rose Garden of the White House in early April, these so-called reciprocal tariffs with some very high astronomical numbers. It wasn't entirely exactly clear how all these numbers were even calculated there when it comes to both American foes and at times allies and friends alike there. And then within a week and a half, most of those tariffs were essentially punted in the short term to focus on the China tariffs there. And now it looks like there's a trade deal that's in the makings with China already there. So even the China tariffs, which are the tariffs that many of us kind of, I think, vociferously supported, it looks like even that is kind of, on pause right now. So, I mean, Trump is someone who I think kind of, sticks his finger in the wind. He listens to public polling there. He has advisors who come from a lot of different stripes there. But again, all this is coming, and I probably sound like a broken horse at this point, but this is coming from, I think, a starting place where Donald Trump, you have to understand here, he's not an ideological figure. He's not someone who's coming at this with strong kind of ideological starting places. He's really more of a kind of a transactional figure ultimately. That is where I think a lot of these kind of Middle East, high dollar value commerce deals are coming with these wealthy, Gulf Arab countries and so forth there. So he's willing to wheel and deal a little bit there, and that really, I think, is ultimately going to drive him when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war as well. But Putin, on the other hand, is not a pure wheeler and dealer. He is a pure ideological figure. He is a relic of the KGB. He is a relic of the Cold War. He genuinely ideologically believes in greater Russia, so to speak, this project of kind of at least kind of Soviet era Russian expansionism. And I'm not necessarily saying that Putin has plans to, march into former Soviet territories in the Warsaw Pact area of Eastern Europe or anything there. But I am saying that at least when it comes to a country like Ukraine, he really kind of ideologically does believe that Ukraine has no true right to exist there. And that's a very different starting place than Donald Trump is coming from necessarily there. And that probably is what Putin is thinking there, is just trying to wait out a little bit.
Yeah, and that's why a lot of people believe that Putin's basically trying to buy as much time as he can until Trump's finished his 4 years in office. So, I mean, it's a waiting game, and I guess there's so many updates when it comes to Trump versus Putin and whether Donald Trump's basically going to, change his gears and start going after him like we've seen in the last few days. But I want to move on to a different situation now, Josh. We've seen Donald Trump really approach the Middle East in the last few weeks and basically think, okay, what investments can I get from them and what deals can we do and whether we can get this nuclear deal over the line with Iran. So what we saw over the weekend was US Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem. She visited Israel last week, over the weekend, just a few days after she'd been in Rome for the 5th round of nuclear talks. She then traveled to Israel and basically told Benjamin Netanyahu in a candid and direct way that the message to the American people is we have a president that wants peace, but we also have a president that will not tolerate nuclear Iran capability in the future. They will not be able to get a nuclear weapon, and the president will not allow it. But he also wants Benjamin Netanyahu to be on the same page as him. So what's your response to this delicate situation where the United States is basically asking Israel to be a united front with them amid reports that Israel had actually been planning on attacking Iran's nuclear facilities?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack here. This is a kinetic story. There's a lot of different layers to this story there. First of all, look, it does seem like that there, at this moment, we can probably safely conclude that there are voices within the Trump administration that I think are mixed when it comes to Prime Minister Netanyahu, when it comes to how to balance the U.S.'s historic relationship with Israel with the threat of a nuclear Iran. For instance, there was this leak to CNN, of all outlets, actually about a week and a half ago there, where Trump administration voices did seem to leak to CNN alleged plans of potential Israeli plans for a strike on Iran there. That, frankly, is the kind of leak that you would have expected from the Barack Obama administration or the Joe Biden administration. Definitely not something that you would have expected from Donald Trump's first term in office there. So it does seem to me like some of the more Israel skeptical, kind of pro-Qatar wing, shall we say, of the MAGA movement, folks like Tucker Carlson certainly, I think, are kind of throwing their weight around, at least in certain quarters there. On the other hand, you do have this consistent rhetoric from the President of the United States, from increasingly from Steve Witkoff, the Middle East Special Envoy, someone who I've been at times critical of, but even he, in the more recent past, has been very consistent with his rhetoric that enrichment is a very hard red line for the United States, that Iran simply will not be able to enrich anything there. I find it very hard to believe, frankly, that the mullahs and ultimately Ayatollah Khamenei himself are ultimately going to negotiate on the enrichment front. It seems like they are pretty committed to enriching uranium. So we're going to have some sort of push comes to shove moment. I don't know exactly how that is going to unfold or what is going to look like there. I think it's also important to understand that here, the United States has a very, very strong interest, to be clear, a very strong interest in ensuring that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon. This is a country that quite literally chants death to America in its Potemkin legislature every day. So it is a country that has American blood on its hands, literally going back to the hostage crisis that birthed the regime in the first place, 1979. But the American interest and the Israeli interest are not the exact same when it comes to Iran there. Both countries have a strong interest in ensuring that Iran has a nuclear weapon. Israel obviously has a stronger interest, given that it is geographically quite closer, and it would be a lot easier technologically to get a potential nuclear warhead, God forbid, over there to that country there. So, part of that is that tension that you're seeing play out where the interests are not exactly one-to-one there, but hopefully it'll work out. I'm skeptical of the negotiations insofar as I think that these are people, the mullahs, that you simply cannot trust. They have been lying about their nuclear program for 2 to 3 decades, and I see no particular reason to think that they're going to start being truthful and open up all the facilities to inspectors and so forth now. So I'm quite skeptical, but ideally, everyone prefers diplomacy to military action, kinetic action, whatever you want to call it there. So hopefully there's some diplomatic way out there, but I do find myself quite skeptical of it.
And I wonder how the United States, and this is not to say that they've said this to Israel, but if they do say to Israel, look, you've got to play nice with Iran, you've got to stop any sort of attacks on Iran or any attacks on Houthis or whatever that may be. But the reality is Iran is housing a number of terrorists. They're, of course, funding a lot of what Hamas is doing to Israelis or to Palestinians. So it's a really delicate situation, Josh, and I kind of wonder how the United States can kind of, and I wouldn't say they're mediating anything, and I wouldn't say they're in the middle, but I wonder how they can try and broker a deal with Iran without hurting the relationship with Israel.
So I think what you're seeing play out in real time here is the Republican Party's foreign policy debate kind of happening out in real time on the world stage there. I mean, that's basically what's happening here. You have a genuine divide in the Republican Party, frankly, a genuine divide even in Donald Trump's own MAGA America First movement. I mean, Donald Trump's first term in office, his policies when it comes to this particular part of the world, this very volatile part of the world, the Middle East there, his policies in the first term were very straightforward. America will stand by and embolden its friends, and it will punish its enemies there. So that was pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal back in 2018. That was crippling maximum pressure sanctions on Iran. That was all the various ways that the United States stood with Israel and the more moderate non-Islamist Sunni Arab Gulf states, ultimately culminating in the Abraham Accords peace deals. What you're seeing here in this second-term foreign policy thus far is indeed slightly different than the first time around. It's a little bit more muddled, where you have more proactive reach out to countries such as Iran, such as Qatar, such as even to Syria, frankly, that do not necessarily fit, shall we say, the traditional American conception of an allied power there. And again, this really is kind of this ongoing MAGA foreign policy war playing out in real time. I've been critical of the president's outreach to Qatar, which is really the number one funder of Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood and Sunni Islamism region-wide and in many ways worldwide. I'm not a fan, frankly, of this extraordinarily expensive plane from the Qatari Emir that I guess will be retrofitted to serve as Air Force One there. It seems to me like a quote-unquote gift of that nature has some pretty serious strings attached to it, shall we say there. So I would personally encourage the president to return to his first-term foreign policy approach to the region, which is namely just emboldening your friends and punishing your enemies there. Seems to me like that worked quite well the first time around there, but I guess we'll see how it plays out the second time around.
Well, I want to get into that, Josh, because this trip to the Middle East did seem a bit odd, and we can get into the Donald Trump's Trump Organization personal benefits from it, but I think we'll leave that and talk about face value of Trump visiting the Middle East with the goal of bringing back $1 or $2 trillion worth of investments in the US. You could argue that this was in reaction to the fact that tariffs, the amount of tariffs that he was wanting to invoke could hurt the American economy, and so that maybe the way out from that was to continue the tariffs, but also have all these international investments from these Gulf states. But one of them that you mentioned in Qatar was it's a very contradictory thing to be going to the country that is housing Hamas, but also funding up to $1 point something billion into a terrorist organization that has killed, thousands of Israelis and started a war. So I found it quite interesting to see that not only has Trump come home with $243 billion worth of an agreement with Qatar, and then also a separate agreement with Boeing, but also then taking that $400 million 747 plane from Qatar that, as you mentioned, yes, would be fit to be Air Force One once the defense team get involved there and make it safe. But this felt like, to me, my first reaction to watching him in Qatar was, I would love to be a fly on the wall in Netanyahu's office, because it did feel like a slap in the face to not only Israelis, but also Jewish Americans.
Well, Israeli media is definitely not, shall we say, particularly happy, with the president's, recent trips to the Middle East there, the fact that he did not visit Israel on this trip there, the fact that the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, he had a separate delegation planned to Israel. They actually called that off as well. Vice President J.D. Vance then was allegedly set to visit Israel. They called that off as well there. So based on what I can tell from surveying Israeli media, they're not exactly super happy right now. Now, again, you have a lot of mixed messaging from the Trump administration. This is still the same Trump administration that back in late January, early February, which is really not that long ago, with Benjamin Netanyahu there, at the White House. And by the way, Netanyahu, for all the allegations of a rift between Trump and Netanyahu, let's not forget that Netanyahu is the only foreign leader to visit the White House twice in just the first few months of the Trump presidency. That actually, I think, says a lot there. But Trump just a few months ago was talking about how Hamas has to have the gates of hell open up against them there. He was talking about this relocation plan of Arabs from Gaza there. NBC News has been reporting potential rumors of a plan to relocate potentially 1 million or more Palestinian Arabs to the northern African country of Libya. So there's so much going on. It's a little hard to tell exactly what is fact and what is fiction. You mentioned Qatar, though. Look, I'm not a fan of Qatar. I think Qatar is a very bad actor. In my new book, Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation, The Destiny of the West, I actually say that Qatar really properly ought to be a formal U.S. State Department designated state sponsor of terror, similar to Iran, formerly Syria under Bashar al-Assad, Cuba, and so forth there. That is how I view Qatar, because they are the world's number one funder of the Muslim Brotherhood and Sunni Islamist causes, more generally speaking there. I had much less of an issue with the president's outreach to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which I think are at least potentially and best viewed as Iran bulwarks there. That's certainly how Trump treated those two countries during the first term. But again, Trump's approach to the region the first term was predicated on this very stark dichotomy between the Western aligned countries, namely Israel, and the non-Islamist Arab states, so Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, and then the more Islamist Iran-friendly states. So that would primarily be Iran itself, Qatar, and Turkey under Recep Tayyip Erdogan. That was kind of the dichotomy during the first Trump term. What you're seeing in the second Trump term between the Qatari outreach, between the Iranian negotiations there, you're seeing these lines increasingly blurred. And the blurring of these lines, I think, does potentially cause a fair bit of concern there. But look, I mean, not all is lost here, right? I mean, Donald Trump's administration. I mean, look at his various, personnel figures in place. I mean, people like Mike Huckabee as ambassador to Israel, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, Pete Hegseth there. These are people who take a very, very, very positive view of U.S.'s relations. So, Donald Trump is not abandoning Israel or anything like that there, but there is definitely reason for concern as well, and I'm not going to whitewash it.
Of course. And on that note as well, Josh, but on more of a domestic level, we've seen this war of words, this showdown between Donald Trump and Harvard University take place in the last few months, but not more so in the last week, where Trump, he threatened to pull $3 billion worth of federal grants. And first of all, I will say, when most people who aren't American don't know that these elite universities even get federal money. I wasn't even aware that they would even receive that. So he's threatened to take away $3 billion worth of federal grants and then halt the university's ability to enroll anyone from overseas, which is like 27% of all students. So this is in reaction to the fact that Harvard, along with other Ivy Leagues, have been accused of being anti-Semitism because they've held various protests, anti-Israel protests. So what's your reaction to Trump's threats of this and the fact that he said that he's probably just going to give that $3 billion to trade schools?
I think that the president's instincts on higher education in America are 1,000% correct. I think that this is one of the second Trump administration's most righteous, justified, and frankly, in many ways, overdue policy initiatives there. Look, American higher education gets extraordinarily favorable tax treatment from the American taxpayer there. The endowments of these universities like Harvard are taxed at rates potentially as at times as low as 1.4%. The federal government has a monopoly on student loans, therefore incentivizing students to basically go enroll at universities with at least lower upfront costs. They get all sorts of just direct taxpayer grants, as you were saying. Sometimes these grants amount to billions and billions of dollars there. All of these various fiscal policy and tax treatments are ultimately predicated upon what I've formulated as an implicit quid pro quo between we, the people who are sovereign in America, and our institutions of higher education. The quid pro quo is essentially as follows. The quid pro quo is, as long as higher education actually sculpts the minds of young men and women who will conduce to the common good of America there, who will be good, knowledgeable, virtuous, upstanding citizens and so forth, then we, the people, will subsidize you because you are ultimately producing a public good. The problem is that American higher education dropped its end of the quid pro quo, I would argue, a very long time ago, probably well before I was even born. But we've seen that really kind of explode and make it even more obvious over the past few years. The post-October 7th nonsense on campuses is really quite extraordinary there. Universities like Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, Princeton, a lot of these prestigious traditional Ivy League or Ivy League equivalent universities there, it truly is no longer obvious that they should be receiving some sort of favorable tax treatment from the American people. So I actually love what Donald Trump is doing there. I give him 3 cheers, actually, for his approach to higher education. I very much hope that it continues.
So you don't think it's anything to do with the fact that Barron Trump didn't get into Harvard, Josh?
It seems to me like Barron Trump is quite happy going to NYU. He strikes me as a bit of a city kid, shall we say?
A bit of a New Yorker. Well,
Yeah.
Josh Hammer, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
My pleasure. Thank you.